The autumn, our crop failed, when the whole of our settlement was staring down a winter with empty cellars and no money and no help within 60 miles. The only man who was not afraid was the one man none of us had ever troubled to respect, a half-Indian hunter named Baptiste Ferron. And he was not afraid because he was looking at the same brown, dead prairie we were looking at, and seeing, where we saw starvation, a country full of food. He tried to tell us so that fall, and we did not listen, because he was what he was, and we were what we were. And it took us until we were genuinely hungry to understand that the man we had looked down on for years was the only person in that settlement who actually knew how to live on that land. My name is Josiah Bell, and I was one of the ones who looked down on him, and I am the one telling you this, because a debt like the one I owe Baptiste Ferron is not paid by staying quiet about it. And I have stayed quiet too long already, being ashamed, and shame kept private helps no one. You have to understand where we were and what we were. A settlement of American and Norwegian and German farm families on the far edge of the settled country, out past the last town, on land that was cheap because it was remote and hard. We had come there to farm it the way we had farmed back east, with the plow and the wheat and the garden, and in the good years it worked well enough. But we were, every one of us, strangers to that country in the deepest way, in that we knew only the one way of getting food from it, which was to grow it, in the tame, domestic manner we had brought with us. And we knew nothing whatever of the country itself, of what it was and what it held, because we had never needed to. We looked at the wild prairie all around our fields as waste, as empty ground not yet plowed, useless until it was tamed. And we did not know one single thing that grew wild on it, whether it would feed a man or kill him, because we had never had to ask. Baptiste Ferron was the opposite of us in every way, which is why we did not value him. He was Métis, as they were called, the child of a French fur trader father and a Cree and Ojibwe mother, born of the old world of the trade that had been in that country long before we farmers ever came to break it. And he belonged to the land in a way that we, who owned deeds to pieces of it, did not and could not. He lived at the edge of our settlement, hunting and trapping and guiding, taking odd work, keeping a little cabin and a garden of his own that was half wild plants we did not recognize. And he was, to us, a figure to be a little wary of, and more than a little to look down on. Half-breed, we called him, and worse, and we carried without ever examining it the settled conviction of our kind and our time that a man of mixed and native blood was a lesser man, less civilized, less to be trusted, less than us. And we treated Baptiste Ferron with the careless disrespect that conviction produced, hiring him when we needed a thing hunted or tracked and forgetting him otherwise, and never once imagining that he knew anything worth our learning. Here is the thing about Baptiste Ferron that we all noticed and none of us understood, and I will tell it now because it was the key to everything. He was always gathering. All through the seasons, when we saw him at all, he had a way of stopping and stooping as he walked, of pulling a plant here and a seed head there, of digging with a stick at the base of some weed and putting a root in his bag, of noticing things at the edges of our fields and along the sloughs that we walked past 10 times a day and never saw. He gathered things from the wild prairie, the way we harvested from our gardens, steadily, knowingly, all year, and we thought it was a quaint and slightly pathetic thing, the half-breed grubbing in the weeds for his supper because he had no proper farm, and we felt for him a pity that had contempt curled up inside it. We did not understand that Baptiste Ferron, walking across what we called empty waste ground, was walking through a stocked larder that he could read and we could not, and that every stooping and gathering we pitied him for was him doing, easily and well, the very thing our whole way of life had made us incapable of doing, which was feeding himself directly from the land we lived on and did not know. What Baptiste Ferron understood, and what we in our plowed and fenced ignorance did not, was the plainest and oldest truth about that country, which our kind had forgotten so completely that we could stand in the middle of plenty and call it emptiness. The prairie was not waste. The prairie was, to one who knew it, one of the richest larders on the earth, and it had fed the people of that country abundantly for longer than anyone could count, long before a plow ever touched it. It was full of food, wild food, in every season. Roots and tubers that could be dug in quantity, the prairie turnip and others, starchy and nourishing and keepable. Seeds and wild grains that could be gathered by the bushel, berries in their season to be dried, greens in the spring, and above all, for one who could hunt as Baptiste could, meat, the game that still moved across that country, to be taken and dried into a form that would keep a man alive through any winter. All of this was there, all around us, every day, and it had sustained whole nations of people on that land through droughts and hard winters beyond number. And we, the farmers who had come to improve the country, were as helpless to eat from it as children, because we had brought only one way of feeding ourselves, and had never learned any other. And when that one way failed, as it was about to, we had nothing, while the man we scorned had everything. He tried to tell us, when the crop failed that fall, and I was there, and I remember how we heard him. Our wheat had burned up in a summer of drought, and our gardens with it, and the settlement was looking at winter with almost nothing put by, and there was talk of some of us having to walk out to the settlements 60 miles off, abandoning everything. And real fear, the fear of actual hunger, was settling over us. And Baptiste Ferron came to a gathering of the worried men and said in his quiet way that no one needed to starve and no one needed to leave, that the country would feed us through the winter if we would let him show us how, that there was food enough on the wild land around us to carry the whole settlement to spring if we would gather it now in the little time left before the freeze, and dry it and store it as his mother's people had always done. And we, standing there, frightened with our empty cellars, mostly did not believe him, and some of us were offended, because it sounded to our proud and ignorant ears like being told to go eat weeds and grass roots like animals, like being told to live as we imagined the Indians lived, which our whole notion of ourselves as civilized farming people rose up against. A few listened. Most did not. I did not really, not at first. He said one thing at that gathering that I did not understand until I was hungry, and then I understood it entirely, and have never forgotten it. Someone had scoffed, had said something about not being reduced to grubbing in the dirt for roots like a savage. And Baptiste Ferron looked at the man, not angry, and said, "The ground has been feeding people here a long time before it fed you." He was quite mild about it. It does not know you are too proud to eat. And he left us to think about it. And winter came on, and we found out which of us had been wise to listen. Now, the settlement was not entirely a fool, and a few of the families did listen to Baptiste that fall, mine among them, though I will confess it was my wife who overrode my pride and not my own good sense, and there is a lesson in that, too. And here I must tell the honest part, the part where it was not simple, because the first efforts of the families who did try to follow Baptiste's teaching went wrong in ways that nearly turned everyone against the whole idea. Some of the people who went out to gather, half believing, did it carelessly, having no eye for it, and they brought back the wrong plants, for the prairie that is a larder to one who knows it is also full of things that are worthless or worse, and there is real danger in gathering wild food ignorantly. Some of it will sicken you, and a few people did make themselves ill those first weeks, and the word went round that Baptiste's wild food was poison, and the whole notion a half-breed's foolishness that would kill us quicker than the hunger. And this was the moment that decided everything, and it turned on what kind of man Baptiste Ferron was. He did not take offense and walk away and leave us to our fate, though God knows we had given him reason to. When he learned that people had sickened, he understood at once that the failure was not in the food, but in the ignorant gathering of it, and instead of abandoning us, he did the opposite. He gave more of himself. He said the gathering could not be done by people who did not know the plants, and so he would teach it properly, plant by plant. And he took those of us who would come out onto the prairie with him, day after day in that shortening autumn. And he taught us the way you teach a child its letters. This plant and not that one. This root is food, and that root beside it is not. Here is how you know the good one. Here is where it grows and when. And he was patient with our stupidity in a way we had never been patient with him. He turned our early failure into a school, and the families who came to that school walked out of it, by the freeze, no longer helpless, carrying in their own heads at last a little of the knowledge that had lived in his all along. By the time the ground froze hard that fall, the families who had listened had done a thing that the families who had not would spend the winter bitterly wishing they had done. And I will tell you what it looked like, our strange autumn harvest, because it looked like nothing our people had ever called a harvest before. Alongside what little the failed farms had yielded, the listening families had laid in stores that would have baffled our parents back east. Sacks of wild prairie turnips and other roots, dug by the hundredweight from the ground we had called empty and dried for keeping. Baskets of wild seeds and grains gathered from the sloughs and the grass, dried berries, and, for those who had gone out with Baptiste on the hunt he led that fall, quantities of dried meat and the rich keeping food his mother's people made of dried meat and fat and berries pounded together, that would sustain a working man through the hardest cold better than anything in our own tradition. Our cellars, that should have been empty, and had been all but empty in September, held, by the freeze, a strange, wild plenty, gathered free from the country we had thought was trying to starve us, by the teaching of the man we had scorned. It did not look like a proper farmer's winter store. It looked like the larder of the people who had lived on that land before us, which is exactly what it was. The winter that came was long and hard and hungry across that whole country, and it sorted our settlement, house by house, into those who had listened to Baptiste Ferron and those who had not, as plainly and as pitilessly as anything I ever saw. I will tell you how that winter went, in the houses that had listened and the houses that had not, because the difference between them was the whole proof of Baptiste Ferron, and it shamed every one of us who had scorned him. The families who had not listened, who had let their pride or their doubt keep them from Baptiste's teaching that fall, faced the winter with almost nothing, only the little their failed farms had made, and it did not last. By the deep of the winter they were hungry, truly hungry, in the way that is not a discomfort, but a slow terror, watching their small stores vanish with months of cold still ahead, and nothing beyond the walls, they believed, but frozen, empty prairie. Some of them did try, too late, in the dead of winter, to go out and gather as Baptiste had said, but the time for gathering was the autumn, and under the snow and the frozen ground, the larder was sealed away till spring, and they had missed it. They lived that winter on the charity of the families who had listened, and on what little could be got from the settlements at ruinous cost and effort, and on going hungry, and it was a bitter, frightened, diminished winter for them, and the bitterness was the worse for knowing, as they all knew by then, that they need not have suffered it, that the food had been there in the fall, and they had been too proud to stoop for it. And the families who had listened came through, not in luxury, for it was a hard winter, and wild food carefully rationed is not a feast, but in safety, in sufficiency, never in real danger, on the strange, wild stores they had gathered under Baptiste's teaching, the roots and the seeds and the dried meat and the keeping food, eating through the winter from the country itself, from the larder that had been there all along, that the man we scorned had shown us how to open. My own family was among them, because my wife had listened when I would not, and I spent that winter eating food I had called fit only for savages in September, and being humbly and daily grateful for it, and thinking about the kind of fool a man can be, and the kind of man Baptiste Ferron was, who had offered this knowledge freely to people who had never given him anything but their contempt. I promised I would make the plain sense of it clear, and it is a truth that goes far beyond that one winter, and it humbles me still. The land is never empty. It only looks empty to those who do not know how to read it. We had come to that country certain that it was a blank and useless waste until our plows made it productive. And that certainty was not knowledge. It was the opposite of knowledge. It was our particular ignorance dressed up as superiority. The prairie that we could not feed ourselves from had fed the people of that country in abundance for thousands of years, and the only difference between starving and thriving on it was knowing what it held, a knowledge that Baptiste Ferron possessed in full, and we did not possess at all, and had been too proud even to imagine was worth having. We did not starve that winter, those of us who listened, because a man whose knowledge we had despised turned out to know the one thing that mattered more than everything we prided ourselves on, which was how to actually live on the actual land we were all standing on. Our plows and our deeds and our civilized ways had made us, in the one test that counted, more helpless than we could have believed, and his despised old knowledge had made him, and then us, free. There was no magic in it. It was knowledge, plain, hard, practical knowledge of plants and seasons and country, as real and as learned as anything in a book, carried in the mind of a man we had refused to see as a man who could know things. Mind, it did not make Baptiste Ferron rich, and it did not, at first, even make him thanked as he should have been, and I have to tell that honestly. He gave that knowledge freely, spent his own autumn teaching people who had scorned him, led the hunt that fed us, asked for nothing, and took, in the immediate way of it, little enough in return but the food he gathered for his own use, as he always had. Some of the settlement, even after that winter, could not fully bring themselves to honor a half-breed as their teacher and savior. So deep did the old contempt run, and gave him a grudging, awkward, incomplete gratitude, and I am ashamed to say it took some of us longer than that winter to come all the way round. And the deeper wrong, the one I understand better now than I did then, was never made right at all, for the knowledge Baptiste carried was the inheritance of his mother's people, the people whose land we were on, whom our coming was even then pushing aside, and there is a grief in that under this whole story that a happy ending does not touch, and I will not pretend it away. He saved us with the knowledge of a people we were displacing, and gave it freely, and that is a larger and sadder thing than I knew how to see when I was young. But he was thanked, in the end, by those of us who had the wit and the humility to do it, and the settlement did change. The families who came through that winter on wild food did not forget how they had come through it. The next autumn, and every autumn after, the gathering that had once seemed to us a shameful half-breed grubbing in the weeds became simply a thing our settlement did, a part of how we lived on that country now, laying in the wild stores alongside the tame crop, so that a failed harvest could never again leave us as helpless as it had that first terrible fall. We had learned, at last, to eat from the land we lived on. And Baptiste Ferron was the honored teacher of it, sought out now, his knowledge valued, his cabin a place people came to learn rather than a place they passed with a sneer. And if that was a smaller and later justice than he deserved, it was real, and he accepted it with the same quiet dignity he had accepted our contempt, which shamed us further and taught us more. I will tell you the last of it, the small thing that stays with me. Baptiste Ferron carried always a particular knife, an old trade knife, worn thin with years of use and sharpening, that had been his mother's, and he used it for everything, digging his roots, dressing his game, all the work of feeding himself from the land. And after that winter, my wife, who had listened when I would not, and whose listening had saved us, made for Baptiste a fine new sheath for that old knife, worked in the way her own people back in Norway worked leather, our craft honoring his, and gave it to him. And it was, I think, the first honest gift of respect anyone in our settlement had ever given the man. A thing made with care and given with humility, and he took it with a grave courtesy, and wore it the rest of his life, our Norwegian leather around his mother's Cree knife, which is as good a picture as I know of what might have been possible between our peoples, and mostly was not. He kept that knife and that sheath till he died, and dug the food of the land with it, and fed anyone who came to learn, and asked to the end for nothing. I am an old man now, and I have lived on that country all my life, and I eat from it still, both ways, the tame and the wild, the way Baptiste Ferron taught us when I was young and foolish and proud. People hear this story and think it is about a clever way to find food in hard times. And it is that. But it is more than that. And the more is the part I most want you to carry. It is about the arrogance that let us stand starving in the middle of plenty because we would not learn from the one who knew. And it is about the particular kind of knowledge, older and deeper than ours, that we came so close to trampling without ever knowing what it was worth. The land was never empty. We were empty of the knowledge to read it, and a man we had every reason to expect nothing from, and had given nothing to, filled that emptiness freely, and saved us, and asked for nothing. I have tried to be, in the years since, a little less certain that I already know everything worth knowing, and a little more willing to learn from those my kind is quick to look past, because the one time it mattered most, everything I thought made me superior was worthless, and everything I had despised was the difference between living and starving. You are never as wise as your pride tells you, and the land is never as empty as it looks, and the person you are too proud to learn from may be the one who knows the thing that saves your life. Now, this settlement and these people are ours, but here is what is true, and it matters that it be said with respect. The prairies and plains were never the empty waste that arriving farmers so often took them to be. They were a rich and varied larder that had sustained indigenous peoples abundantly for thousands of years, through drought and hard winter, on wild foods that settlers were largely ignorant of. The prairie turnip and many other wild roots, wild seeds and grains, berries and greens, were real and important foods, and pemmican, the keeping food of dried meat, fat, and berries, was among the most effective preserved foods ever devised, sustaining people, and later the fur trade, across that whole country. The Métis, children of indigenous and European parents, were a real people of the northern plains and the fur trade, and often served exactly as this kind of bridge, carrying the practical knowledge of how to live on that land. Settler communities that survived hard years frequently did so on indigenous knowledge and foodways, freely shared, even as the people who held that knowledge were being displaced. And that is a real and painful part of this history that ought not be smoothed away. Baptiste Ferron and his neighbors are imagined. The wild abundance of that country, the knowledge of how to live on it, and the debt so many owed to those who held that knowledge are exactly as they were.